Sometimes loyalty is so strong that even time cannot convince it to let go. On a cold October morning in Calgary, Alberta, a German shepherd sat quietly behind a chain-link fence while the city moved around him as if he did not exist. A light rain drifted through the streets, turning sidewalks silver beneath the street lamps and painting the glass towers downtown with trembling reflections. The air carried the scent of wet pavement, fresh coffee, and the first warning of an approaching Canadian winter. Near the eastern side of the city, beside a municipal animal holding facility, the old dog remained perfectly still. He did not bark when people walked past. He did not pace along the fence like the others. He simply watched. His coat had once been thick and proud, but age had softened it. Silver traced the edges of his muzzle. Every movement carried the stiffness of years. To most people, he looked like another forgotten dog. Another shepherd abandoned when life became inconvenient. A clipboard hung outside his kennel. The information was brief. Male. Estimated 11 years old. Found wandering near a downtown transit station. No microchip detected. No owner could be located. The employees had stopped paying much attention to him. They had seen hundreds of animals pass through these gates. Some frightened. Some aggressive. Some lucky enough to find homes quickly. This shepherd seemed different. Not difficult. Not unfriendly. Just distant. As though he were waiting for something no one else could see. Poor old guy, one worker said while carrying supplies through the corridor. At his age, it won't be easy finding someone willing to adopt him. Another glanced toward the kennel and sighed. Maybe he had a family once. The shepherd never reacted. His amber eyes remained fixed beyond the fence. Every passing vehicle earned a brief glance. Every uniform caught his attention. Then he would settle into silence again. The hours moved slowly. Rain tapped softly against the metal roof overhead. Somewhere beyond the facility, a train horn echoed through the gray morning. Around noon, a volunteer placed a bowl of food inside the enclosure. The shepherd approached. Sniffed once. Then stepped away. He drank water instead. Afterward, he returned to the exact same position facing the road. That's the third meal he's ignored, the volunteer muttered. Maybe he's sick. The veterinarian examined him later that afternoon. There were signs of age. Fatigue. A few aches expected in an elderly dog. But no serious illness. Nothing that explained the strange behavior. What puzzled her most was the way he carried himself. Even when tired. Even when hungry. His posture remained alert. Disciplined. Deliberate. As if years of training still lingered beneath the weight of time. By late afternoon, the rain softened into a thin mist. Traffic thickened as commuters headed home. Red brake lights glowed through the damp air like scattered embers. The shepherd slowly rose onto his feet. His ears lifted. For the first time all day, genuine focus sharpened his expression. A police cruiser rolled through the intersection across the street. The old dog took several careful steps forward. Hope flickered briefly inside his eyes. Fragile. Quiet. Almost painful to witness. He watched the cruiser until it disappeared around a corner. Then he lowered himself back onto the concrete floor. The hope faded. But not completely. He kept staring toward the road. Waiting. As evening settled across Calgary, darkness spread through the city. The kennel lights flickered on one by one. Most of the dogs barked at shadows and passing sounds. The old shepherd remained silent. Beyond the fence, headlights appeared at the entrance to the parking lot. Another patrol vehicle turned slowly through the gate. Water shimmered across the asphalt beneath its beams. The shepherd lifted his head. This time he did not blink. This time he did not look away. Somewhere deep inside him, something seemed to recognize the sound before the vehicle even stopped. The cruiser rolled forward through the mist and parked near the entrance. A man stepped out, pulling his jacket collar higher against the cold rain. The shepherd rose carefully to his feet. Age showed in the movement. But so did purpose. For the first time since arriving at the facility, he looked as though the thing he had been waiting for might finally be here. The rain continued falling in a fine silver mist as Constable Ethan McAllister crossed the parking lot toward the entrance of the animal facility. At 41 years old, Ethan carried the quiet confidence of a man who had spent most of his adult life in uniform. His short brown hair had begun turning gray at the temples, and faint lines around his eyes hinted at years spent solving problems that rarely had simple answers. He had stopped by for a routine favor. A neighbor had recently lost a Labrador retriever, and Ethan had promised to check whether any recent arrivals matched the description. Nothing more. Nothing important. At least that was what he believed. A staff member greeted him near the front desk and led him toward the kennel corridor. The building smelled faintly of disinfectant, damp concrete, and wet fur. Most of the dogs reacted immediately when Ethan appeared. Some barked hopefully. Others pressed against the fencing in search of attention. Ethan moved slowly past each enclosure, reading identification cards and occasionally stopping to study a face. Then he noticed something unusual. One kennel remained completely silent. The elderly German shepherd sat exactly where he had been earlier that day. Facing the road. Watching. Waiting. Ethan slowed his pace. The shepherd turned his head toward him. That was all. No barking. No whining. No desperate attempt to attract attention. The dog simply studied him with calm amber eyes. Something about that gaze felt familiar. Ethan could not explain why. He stepped closer to the fence. The shepherd rose carefully onto his feet. Age showed in the movement, but dignity remained. Every step seemed measured. Intentional. For several seconds neither moved. Rainwater tapped softly against the roof overhead. Somewhere farther down the corridor another dog barked twice before falling silent again. The shepherd took one slow step closer. Then another. His eyes never left Ethan's face. "You seem different from the others," Ethan murmured quietly. The dog tilted his head. Not fearful. Not excited. Merely attentive. As though listening. Ethan felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. Years earlier, during training assignments around police canine units, he had learned something important. Working dogs carried themselves differently. Discipline lingered in the smallest habits. The way they observed. The way they waited. The way they seemed to understand more than they revealed. This shepherd carried that same presence. Ethan crouched slightly and rested one hand against the fence. The dog stepped forward until only the metal barrier separated them. The overhead light illuminated the left side of his face. Ethan froze. Just above the shepherd's left eye rested a narrow crescent-shaped scar partially hidden beneath fading fur. Small. Old. Easy to miss. Yet the moment Ethan saw it, something stirred deep within his memory. A face. A photograph. A name he could almost reach but could not quite grasp. The feeling lingered long after he left the kennel. 20 minutes later Ethan sat inside a small office near the front desk. The room was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of rain against a narrow window. He opened a municipal database and began searching. German Shepherd. Retired police canine. Scar above left eye. Western Canada. Hundreds of results appeared. Most led nowhere. Ethan rubbed his eyes and adjusted the search parameters. Older records. Archived files. Retired service dogs from Alberta. The list narrowed. Photographs appeared one after another. Different dogs. Different handlers. Different stories. None matched. Then a name surfaced unexpectedly from somewhere deep inside his memory. Ethan stopped typing. For a moment he simply stared at the screen. Then he entered a single word. Atlas. The search returned one archived file from a former regional police canine program. Ethan opened it. A photograph appeared. A younger German shepherd stood proudly beside his handler. Alert ears. Strong posture. Intelligent amber eyes. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. The resemblance was unmistakable. Then his attention shifted to a red banner displayed across the top of the record. He read the words twice before he fully understood them. Status, deceased. Ethan slowly looked through the office window toward the kennel outside. The old shepherd was still there. Sitting quietly. Watching the road. Waiting. And suddenly one impossible question settled into the silence. If Atlas was dead, then who was sitting in that kennel tonight? The question followed Ethan home that night and remained there long after the rain had stopped. If Atlas was dead, then who had spent the last several days sitting quietly inside that kennel? By sunrise the next morning, a blanket of low gray clouds stretched across southern Alberta. Calgary moved through its usual rhythm. Trains crossed the city. Coffee shops filled with commuters escaping the cold. Traffic rolled steadily along wet streets. But Ethan McAllister could not stop thinking about the old shepherd. Shortly after 8 o'clock, he returned to the animal facility carrying a travel mug of coffee and a folder containing printed records from the previous evening. Atlas was already awake. The shepherd sat near the front of the enclosure watching the entrance as though he had been expecting him. The moment their eyes met, the dog rose carefully to his feet. His movements remained slow with age, yet there was something reassuring in the calm certainty behind them. Ethan approached the fence. "Good morning, old friend," he said quietly. Atlas stepped forward and settled near the barrier. No barking. No excitement. Just recognition. Ethan spent most of the morning reviewing the archived file. The photograph was old, but every detail matched. The amber eyes. The facial structure. Most importantly, the crescent-shaped scar above the left eye. Around midday he located a contact number attached to the retirement records. The name belonged to a retired canine handler named Daniel Mercer. Ethan hesitated before dialing. The line rang several times before a weary voice answered. Ethan introduced himself and explained why he was calling. Silence followed. Long enough for Ethan to wonder if the connection had been lost. Finally Mercer spoke. "That cannot be possible." Ethan looked through the office window toward Atlas. The shepherd had settled into a patch of pale sunlight near the fence. "That was my first reaction too," Ethan replied. "But I am looking at him right now." Another pause. Then Mercer asked a single question. "Does he have a scar above his left eye?" Ethan sat upright immediately. "Yes." A slow breath came through the receiver. "Then it is him." For several seconds neither man spoke. Years seemed to hang between them. Finally Ethan broke the silence. "The file says Atlas died years ago." Mercer sounded genuinely confused. "That is what I was told. After his retirement, I tried to adopt him myself. Life became complicated. A placement organization found another home for him. About a year later I received notice that he had passed away from age-related health issues." Ethan glanced again toward the kennel. Atlas remained quietly alert, watching vehicles move beyond the fence. "Did you ever see proof?" Ethan asked. "No," Mercer admitted softly. "I trusted the paperwork." The conversation lasted nearly another hour. By the time it ended, one thing had become clear. Someone had reported Atlas deceased. Whether it had been a mistake or something else, neither man knew. But the record was wrong. Atlas was alive. As afternoon settled over the city, Ethan stood beside the kennel once more. Beyond the fence, a patrol cruiser rolled slowly past the facility. Atlas immediately lifted his head and followed it with his eyes until it disappeared from view. There was no excitement. No anxiety. Only focus. The kind that comes from searching for something familiar. Ethan watched him carefully. The old shepherd was not simply looking at vehicles. He was looking for something connected to a life that had once mattered. And for the first time, Ethan began to suspect that Atlas had not arrived in Calgary by accident. The possibility stayed with Ethan throughout the rest of the week. Atlas had been found alone near a downtown transit station, yet everything about the shepherd suggested purpose rather than confusion. On Thursday morning, sunlight finally pushed through the clouds and spread across Calgary in pale bands of gold. The first frost of the season still clung to patches of grass beside the roads, and a sharp autumn wind carried the scent of spruce and distant wood smoke through the city. Ethan arrived at the facility earlier than usual. Atlas was waiting near the front of the kennel. Not pacing. Not restless. simply watching. As though the old dog measured time differently from everyone else. Ethan spent the morning tracing every document connected to Atlas's retirement. The deeper he looked, the stranger the story became. The placement organization responsible for retired service dogs no longer existed. Several files had been archived. Others appeared incomplete. Entire sections of paperwork were missing. Around midday, Ethan managed to reach a former administrator who had worked there years earlier. The woman sounded surprised when he mentioned Atlas's name. "I remember him," she said. "Everybody did. He was one of the gentlest dogs we ever handled." Ethan leaned forward in his chair. "Do you know what happened after he was adopted?" Papers rustled on the other end of the line. "Not exactly. I remember there was some confusion. The original family relocated. After that, ownership records became difficult to follow." Ethan thanked her and ended the call, but the answer only created more questions. Later that afternoon another lead emerged. A retired records supervisor from an old K-9 unit returned one of Ethan's messages. The men remembered Atlas immediately. More importantly, he remembered something else. That dog had exceptional tracking and orientation instincts, he explained. "I saw him return to command locations from several kilometers away during search exercises. Sometimes he seemed to remember routes better than people did." Ethan glanced through the office window toward the kennel. Atlas had moved into a patch of sunlight and was resting quietly there. The old shepherd looked peaceful, yet his ears remained alert to every distant sound. A thought slowly formed in Ethan's mind. What if Atlas had not simply wandered into Calgary? Not because he remembered every detail from years ago. Not because of some miracle. But because fragments of familiar places still lived somewhere inside him. Familiar roads. Familiar scents. Familiar landmarks connected to a life he once understood. Before leaving work that evening, Ethan requested the original report from Animal Control. When the document arrived, he studied the map carefully. The location where Atlas had first been found was not random. The transit corridor connected several older districts of the city, including areas not far from locations tied to the shepherd's former working years. It was far from proof. Still, the pattern was difficult to ignore. Outside, the sun dipped lower behind the skyline. Long shadows stretched across the parking lot. Atlas slowly rose and approached the fence nearest the road. Traffic flowed steadily beyond the facility. The old dog watched every vehicle with patient attention. Then something unusual happened. His ears lifted. He turned slightly toward the south side of the city and remained perfectly still. Ethan followed his gaze. There was nothing remarkable there. Just distant streets disappearing toward older neighborhoods and forgotten corners of Calgary. Yet Atlas continued looking in that direction as though listening to a memory no one else could hear. And for the first time, Ethan began to wonder whether the answers they were searching for might still be waiting somewhere out there. The following morning arrived beneath a clear autumn sky, the kind that seemed almost too bright after so many days of cloud and rain. Sunlight reflected from office windows downtown and turned the Bow River into a ribbon of gold. Ethan reached the facility shortly after 9 o'clock carrying paperwork he had completed the night before. What he wanted required special approval. Atlas was technically a stray animal under municipal care, but after several conversations and more than a little persistence, Ethan had finally received permission to take the old shepherd on a supervised outing. The staff welcomed the idea. Over the past week Atlas had become something of a mystery to everyone there. The kennel gate opened with a metallic click. Atlas stepped forward calmly. There was no hesitation. No nervousness. The leash hung loosely between them as they crossed the parking lot together. Ethan expected the dog to move cautiously after spending so much time confined, yet Atlas immediately oriented himself toward the southern part of the city. His ears lifted. His pace became steady. Purposeful. Almost certain. Ethan guided him into the cruiser and drove slowly, allowing the shepherd to remain relaxed. Calgary unfolded around them beneath crisp blue skies. Traffic flowed through downtown streets. Cyclists moved along pathways beside the river. Children played in parks scattered among neighborhoods dressed in autumn colors. Atlas sat quietly in the back seat, watching through the window. Occasionally his head would turn toward a familiar intersection or a passing landmark, but he never barked. He simply observed. Nearly 30 minutes later, Ethan parked near one of the older districts connected to several retired service facilities from decades earlier. Atlas stepped from the cruiser and paused. The cool wind stirred his silvered fur. For several seconds he stood motionless. Then he began walking. Ethan followed. The shepherd moved through sidewalks lined with mature spruce trees and past office buildings that had replaced structures long gone. Much of the city had changed. Roads had been widened. Entire blocks had been redeveloped. Yet Atlas continued forward with quiet confidence. Eventually they reached a small park tucked between two streets. It was not large. A few benches sat beneath evergreens. Fallen leaves drifted across neatly maintained grass. At the center stood a polished stone monument. Atlas stopped. The old dog remained perfectly still. Wind rustled through the branches overhead. Traffic hummed softly beyond the park. Ethan studied the monument. As he stepped closer, he realized it honored retired service animals from across Alberta. Names covered the stone. Search and rescue dogs. Mounted service animals. Police canines. Decades of loyalty preserved in engraved letters. Atlas slowly approached the monument and lowered himself onto the grass beside it. Ethan felt a chill despite the sunlight. This did not feel random. The old shepherd rested there quietly, looking toward the memorial as though visiting an old friend. Ethan walked around the stone reading names and dates. Near the base of the monument he noticed a smaller bronze plaque installed several years earlier. It described the contributions of retired service animals and acknowledged an organization dedicated to preserving their history. The Alberta Canine Historical Society. Ethan read the name twice. Below it was a location and contact information. A new lead. A real one. He glanced back. Toward Atlas. The shepherd remained beside the memorial, calm and silent beneath the autumn sun. For the first time since this journey began, Ethan felt as though the old dog had not simply led him to a place. He had led him to the next piece of the story. The discovery at the memorial park stayed with Ethan long after he returned Atlas to the facility. Early the next morning, beneath a pale sky streaked with thin clouds, he drove across Calgary toward the address listed on the bronze plaque. The Alberta Canine Historical Society occupied a modest brick building on a quiet street lined with mature maple trees glowing red and gold in the autumn light. It was not the kind of place most people noticed. A small sign stood beside the entrance. The windows displayed framed photographs of service animals from decades past. Inside, the building smelled faintly of old paper, polished wood, and coffee that had been brewing since dawn. Atlas accompanied him under special permission from the facility. The old shepherd moved calmly beside Ethan as they entered. A bell chimed softly above the door. Behind a reception desk sat an elderly woman with silver hair gathered neatly at the back of her head. She looked up from a stack of documents and smiled. Then her eyes drifted toward Atlas. The smile vanished. For a moment she simply stared. "Well," she whispered, rising slowly from her chair, "I never thought I would see that face again." Ethan exchanged a glance with her. "You know him?" The woman nodded. Everyone here knew him. Her name was Margaret Sullivan. For nearly 30 years she had helped preserve records connected to working animals across Alberta. She approached Atlas carefully. The old shepherd studied her for a few seconds before gently lowering his head. Margaret's eyes glistened. "Atlas," she said softly. "You stubborn old boy." Ethan spent the next hour explaining everything that had happened. The shelter. The scar. The file marked deceased. The retired handler who believed Atlas had died years ago. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she folded her hands together and remained silent for a long moment. "Come with me," she finally said. She led them through a hallway lined with photographs. Dogs standing beside officers. Search teams posing after successful rescues. Graduation ceremonies from years long gone. Atlas moved quietly through the corridor, occasionally pausing near certain photographs as though something about them felt familiar. At the back of the building stood an archive room. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Binders filled every wall. Boxes carried labels dating back decades. Dust floated through beams of sunlight filtering across the room. Margaret disappeared between two shelves and returned carrying a thick binder. She placed it carefully on a table and opened it. Inside were newspaper clippings, retirement certificates, photographs, and service records. Atlas appeared again and again throughout the pages. Younger. Stronger. Standing proudly beside handlers and community members. Ethan turned each page slowly. Then Margaret stopped. Tucked inside a protective sleeve rested a copy of Atlas's original retirement paperwork. Attached behind it was a handwritten placement record. Ethan leaned closer. His pulse quickened. The document contained the name of the family who had adopted Atlas after retirement. More importantly, it contained an address. A real address. Not a missing file. Not a rumor. Not a faded memory. The first concrete lead anyone had uncovered in years. Across the room, Atlas lay quietly near the doorway watching them. Sunlight touched the silver around his muzzle. For the first time since Ethan had met him, the mystery felt smaller. The distance between questions and answers had suddenly narrowed. And somewhere beyond Calgary, connected to a forgotten address on an aging piece of paper, waited the next chapter of Atlas's story. 2 days later, Ethan found himself driving north beneath an enormous Alberta sky. The address from the archive led beyond Calgary, past expanding suburbs and open stretches of prairie where fields rolled toward the horizon in shades of gold and amber. Beside him sat Daniel Mercer, the retired handler whose voice had first confirmed Atlas's identity. Years had added silver to Mercer's hair and softened the sharp edges of his face, but every time he glanced into the rearview mirror, something changed in his expression. Atlas rested quietly in the back seat. He had spent most of the journey watching the landscape pass beyond the window. Not anxious. Not excited. Simply attentive. The farther they traveled, the quieter the vehicle seemed to become. After nearly 90 kilometers, they turned onto a gravel road lined with trembling aspens. Fallen leaves danced across the ground as a cool wind swept through the branches. Ahead stood a modest farmhouse painted white, surrounded by fencing, open pasture, and a weathered red barn that had clearly endured many Canadian winters. Smoke drifted gently from a chimney. The place felt peaceful. Lived in. Loved. Ethan parked near the front gate and switched off the engine. For a moment no one moved. Then the front door opened. An elderly woman stepped onto the porch. She wore a thick knitted cardigan and held one hand against the railing as she looked toward the unfamiliar vehicle. At first her expression showed only curiosity. Then her eyes settled on Atlas through the window. Everything changed. She froze. One hand rose slowly toward her mouth. Ethan opened the rear door. Atlas stepped out carefully onto the gravel. The old shepherd paused. His ears lifted slightly. The woman descended the porch steps without taking her eyes off him. Tears appeared before she had even reached the bottom. Atlas, she whispered. The name seemed to carry years inside it. Atlas remained still. The wind moved softly through his fur. The woman approached another few meters and stopped. Tears rolled freely down her cheeks now. "Oh, Atlas," she said again, her voice breaking. Daniel Mercer lowered his head and quietly looked away. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Some reunions arrived with noise and celebration. Others arrived in silence. This was one of those. The woman's name was Helen Porter. As they introduced themselves and explained why they had come, she struggled to contain her emotions. More than 10 years earlier, her family had adopted Atlas after his retirement from service. He had lived with them for several years. Then, during a long road trip through another province, severe weather and unexpected circumstances led to a separation that no one had ever been able to explain completely. They searched. Volunteers searched. Local shelters were contacted. Posters were distributed. Weeks became months. Months became years. Eventually hope faded beneath the weight of time. Yet Helen never stopped wondering. She never stopped looking whenever she saw an elderly German shepherd in a photograph or beside a roadside fence. As she spoke, Atlas stood quietly watching her. Not confused. Not uncertain. Watching. Listening. Remembering. Finally Helen brushed away her tears and managed a small smile. "Please," she said softly. "Come inside." Ethan opened the gate. Atlas took a slow step forward. Then another. Without hesitation, he crossed the threshold of the property he had not seen in more than a decade. And somewhere deep inside the old shepherd, something seemed to settle at last. The moment Atlas entered the farmhouse, the atmosphere changed in a way no one could fully explain. It was not dramatic. There were no sudden reactions or impossible displays of memory. Instead, there was a quiet certainty that settled over the house like evening sunlight. Ethan and Daniel Mercer followed Helen inside while the old shepherd moved at his own pace across the hardwood floor. The farmhouse carried the comforting scent of cedar, baked bread, and wood smoke lingering from the fireplace. Family photographs covered the walls. A clock ticked softly in the kitchen. Outside, the prairie wind brushed against the windows. Atlas paused near the entrance and slowly looked around. His amber eyes moved from one room to another. Then, without waiting for anyone, he began walking deeper into the house. Helen watched with trembling hands. Every step seemed to carry a memory she could not see. Atlas passed the kitchen. Past the dining table. Ignored the voices around him completely. It was as though he was searching for something known only to him. The old shepherd eventually entered the living room. There, beside a stone fireplace darkened by years of winter fires, sat an old dog bed. The fabric had faded. One corner showed signs of wear. Time had left its mark on it, just as it had on everything else in the house. Yet it remained exactly where it had always been. Helen pressed a hand against her mouth. "I never moved it," she whispered. Atlas approached the bed slowly. He lowered his head and sniffed once. Then, with the quiet dignity that had followed him throughout this journey, he turned in a small circle and carefully lowered himself onto the cushion. The room fell silent. Helen began to cry. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just the kind of tears that arrive when grief finally makes room for relief. Daniel Mercer looked away toward the window. Ethan felt his chest tighten. For years everyone had believed Atlas was gone. Yet somehow the old shepherd had returned to the exact place where he once belonged. Later that afternoon Helen brought out photo albums that had remained untouched for years. Dust drifted through beams of sunlight as pages turned. Atlas appeared in nearly every chapter of the family's history. Standing beside children during birthdays. Resting near a frozen lake during winter. Sleeping by the fireplace while snowstorms passed outside. The old shepherd remained on his bed throughout most of it, occasionally lifting his head when Helen spoke his name. As evening approached, something else happened. Atlas rose quietly and crossed the room. He stopped beneath a framed photograph hanging beside the hallway entrance. Ethan followed his gaze. The picture showed a younger Helen standing outside the farmhouse many years earlier. Beside her sat a younger Atlas. His coat was darker then. His posture straighter. But there was no mistaking him. Atlas remained there for several seconds staring at the image. No one spoke. No one interrupted. The moment felt too personal. Too sacred. Eventually he returned to the fireplace and settled onto the old bed once more. The setting sun painted the room in warm shades of gold and amber. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly beneath a sky turning violet at the horizon. For the first time since arriving at the shelter in Calgary, Atlas closed his eyes completely. His breathing slowed. The alertness that had kept him watching roads, fences, and passing vehicles finally softened. He no longer looked toward the door. He no longer listened for approaching engines. Surrounded by familiar walls and familiar voices, the old shepherd drifted into the deepest sleep anyone had seen since his story began. Several weeks passed beneath clear autumn skies and steadily cooling temperatures across Alberta. Life settled into a gentle rhythm at the farmhouse. Each morning Helen would open the curtains and find Atlas resting near the fireplace or watching the sunrise spread across the fields beyond the window. The urgency that had once filled his eyes was gone now. He no longer spent hours staring toward distant roads. He no longer listened for every passing vehicle. The long search that had carried him across years and countless kilometers had finally come to an end. Word of Atlas's story slowly spread through the communities connected to his past. Retired officers shared photographs. Former handlers exchanged memories. Volunteers who had worked with service animals remembered the shepherd who had somehow returned after being lost for so long. Eventually, the Alberta Canine Historical Society organized a small gathering at the Memorial Park in Calgary. The event was simple. Exactly the way Atlas would have wanted it if dogs concerned themselves with such things. On a crisp Saturday afternoon, people arrived beneath a sky so blue it seemed endless. Fallen leaves drifted across the pathways. The air carried the scent of spruce and approaching winter. Ethan McAllister stood beside Daniel Mercer near the stone monument. Margaret Sullivan greeted visitors as they arrived. Helen remained close to Atlas, one hand resting gently against his shoulder. The old shepherd moved slowly now, but there was peace in every step. He seemed content simply to be among familiar voices. As the ceremony began, stories were shared. Not stories about dramatic rescues or remarkable achievements. Those already existed in official records. Instead, people spoke about loyalty. About patience. About the quiet courage that allows someone to keep moving forward even when the world believes the journey is over. When the time came, a small plaque was unveiled beside the memorial. The inscription contained only 2 words. Returned home. No one felt the need to say more. The words carried everything. For a few moments the crowd stood silently before the monument. Wind moved softly through the trees overhead. Sunlight reflected across the polished stone. Atlas rested calmly at Helen's feet. No longer forgotten. No longer missing. No longer trapped inside an error buried within old paperwork. He was exactly where he belonged. As evening approached, people slowly drifted away. The park grew quiet once more. Ethan remained for a moment, watching Atlas beside the memorial. Months earlier he had been nothing more than an unidentified dog behind a kennel fence. A forgotten animal waiting beside a road. Now his story had come full circle. Not because of luck. Not because of a miracle. But because loyalty had endured long enough for the truth to catch up. That night the prairie sky stretched overhead in a blanket of stars. Inside the farmhouse, firelight flickered gently across the stone fireplace. Helen sat in her favorite chair reading while the clock ticked softly in the background. Atlas rested on the same worn dog bed he had chosen on the day he returned. The house felt warm. Safe. Familiar. Outside, the wind brushed across the fields and disappeared into the darkness. Atlas opened his eyes once and looked toward the front door. For years he had watched doors. Waited beside them. Wondered what might lie beyond them. This time was different. After a moment, he lowered his head back onto the cushion and closed his eyes again. He did not get up. He did not keep watch. For the first time in many years, there was nothing left to search for. Somewhere beyond memory, beyond distance, beyond every missing record and unanswered question, the old shepherd had found the one thing he had never stopped believing existed. Home. And sometimes that is how the most extraordinary journeys end. Not with applause. Not with headlines. But with a quiet room, a familiar fire, and the peace of finally knowing that you are exactly where you belong.